Broadcasting from Dandenong in Melbourne's southeast, one of the most diverse local government areas in the country. Joining us on the panel, two Victorian rising stars, Labor's Julian Hill and Liberal MP Zoe McKenzie, in a city where Greens and Teals have gained ground. Jon Faine is a well-known broadcaster and commentator. Nyadol Nyuon is a lawyer and chairs the Harmony Alliance, advocating for migrant and refugee women. And Maria Thattil is a writer and an advocate who spoke out recently about being racially abused. Welcome to Q&A. I'd like to pay my respects to the Bunurong people on whose lands we're broadcasting from tonight. And you can stream Q&A on iView and follow us on all the socials. Our first question tonight from our Dandenong audience in the southeast suburbs of Melbourne is from Susie Baddock. Hi, Susie.
Good evening to all of you. My question is this. Communities are having to deal with the increase in youth crime, which includes house break-ins, car theft, knife attacks and general unacceptable behaviour. When are governments and authorities going to stop the excuse-making for lawbreakers and start imposing serious consequences for actions? I fear for the future peace of our communities.
Jon Faine.
So the view just expressed in that question is widely shared. We've just seen a law and order election in the Northern Territory. The government was thrown out. The perception was that they weren't across the issues. Queensland will be the same. We've seen the same in Germany and France. It's across the whole of the world. Now, the statistics, though, don't actually bear out the perception. Some levels of crime are up, some are down. Burglaries are way down. But on the other hand, this gadget is creating a wave of performative crime that goes on social media. And so it's much more visible than ever before. And there are crimes committed, the police say this, there are crimes that are committed just for social media as a performance. Now, the police, for years we've been giving them everything they've asked for. For years and years we've had law and order elections and law and order debates. At what point do we say, well, we're failing at this? It's not working. It's like the war against drugs. It's just not working. We have to try something different. You can't arrest your way out of a crime wave. And you have to ask, well, what's motivating it? And if it's social media, we've got to find ways of dealing with the performative aspect of it. And if we listen to the people who work with the offenders, the youth workers, the criminal justice people, the parole officers, they'll all tell you the same thing. You can't just fight it by trying to arrest everyone and locking them up.
Okay.
It doesn't work.
Nyadol?
Yeah, I think that the question about youth crime, government has legitimate responsibility to protect citizens. There's no excuse about that. We cannot excuse people's houses being invaded or people feeling unsafe. So that's and absolutely something that I think we need to recognise. But I agree with Jon in the sense of two matters. The first is the role of social media and how I think mainstream media plays into that. Because when they emphasise or overemphasise the criminal activities over other stories, it contributes to this idea that there is some sort of attention that you can get from this behaviour, which fits back into the sort of social media context as well. So if we're thinking about the responsibilities that we should, ways of tackling this, one of it is just smart reporting about these things. But I think the other thing I want to pick up on, which it's important, is that yes, these are difficult issues, but the role of mature people and the adults is to deal with these difficult issues, which means, as a result, we cannot be proposing solutions that are in themselves reckless as adults that would cause more problems. For example, I do believe that the age of criminality should not be so low that we are fighting biology. Being tough on crime against 9-year-olds, it's fighting biology, it's not fighting crime. So we have to be We have to be realistic, I think, as adults to accept that these are difficult situations, but we have the responsibility not to be the reckless people in causing more problems in the solutions that we propose. And so I think especially for communities like this, communities where there are problems with inequality, where there are problems with, housing affordability, that, we are often so willing to understand how these things affect older people or older generations. We are so willing to talk about the impact of inequality on a lack of able to afford a house. We're able to conceptualize this and understand that when it's impacting older people. And even sometimes when they engage in bad behavior. But when it comes to young people, somehow we don't connect the fact that these things also affect them, and there must be systemic responses to the issues that contribute to young people criminal offending. There must be, investment in our schools. There must be investment in rehabilitation processes, because these are also, as much as we have to balance that role of holding young people accountable, we have to balance it with our role of also looking after them and finding solutions for them. That's the difficult choice we have.
Susie, I'd love to bring you back in, because the points you make, Susie, I think, and Jon Faine acknowledged that they're being felt across Australia in different parts, not just here in Dandenong or in Victoria. It's in Queensland, it's in the Northern Territory and overseas. But is it your experience that you feel like there's been an uptick in crime or there's more reporting on it? What's your experience of it?
From my perspective, I think there has been an uptake. I think there is so much now lack of respect within the community, because the young people are not being taught what is and isn't acceptable these days, and it is a take what I want attitude now, rather than a let's try and achieve something to get what we want. You know what I mean? And it's very, very difficult, and whilst I understand what you're saying, both of you, in my experience as being on this earth for some time, when we had children, we brought up our children to understand that whatever action you make has to have a consequence to it, and you have to live by those consequences. And right now, it would appear, from my perspective, that there is a thought that you find an excuse for the reason they do something. There is always an excuse for it, rather than saying, this is not appropriate, you should understand that, and there is a consequence for that.
Zoe, there is obviously a big community demand for action on crime, but then you want to do things that work. Peter Dutton's actually, on your side of politics, intervened with all sorts of ideas into all of this, even though it's not really federal responsibility. Why has your side of politics thought that's
we have
necessary?
intervened in relation to the post and boast activity in particular, because that seems to have been driving a certain amount of conduct. Kids with time on their hands, not necessarily being kept at home at night, go out and take cars and stick it up on the internet. And that has become quite a thing. I've spoken to the police in my local area and they said it's happening here now too. And we all need to remember to close our doors at night. Sometimes when you feel like you live in country towns, we forget to do that. But now you must remember to do that wherever you live in Australia. And so, yes, we have been quite clear about post and boast laws amongst other things, but a general sense of providing a sense of community safety. Here in Victoria, we've had significant cuts just to our police stations. Police stations that used to be open 24/7 are now open for 8 hours a day, as though criminals go, right, 9:05, time to get busy. So we need to give a sense of confidence to the community that law and order is there and will be provided if needed. We need to think about what incentivises kids to do this, what is sending them down a path of misadventure and distraction rather than school, work, activity. What you're talking about as well, that external localisation of control, that sense of it's somebody else's fault that my life isn't working out the way it's meant to be. Those messages do need to be reinforced at home as much as they need to be at school, as much as they need to be at work. I find that adults, people like our age, we're busier than maybe, not so much my parents, but some of my friends at school's parents were when I was a kid. You could have lives where people had time to spend more time around the dinner table, better conversations with kids. Everyone is so busy trying to put enough money in their pocket to pay their mortgage. There's not enough time to talk to the kids the way we could and should, frankly.
Julian?
It's terrific that you're here in Dandenong.
Well,
thank
my
you.
old train line.
True confession, of course I was going to come on the show when I was asked, but I did have some pretty sharp words in the office when I said, really, they want to come to Dandenong and talk about crime? So I just want to put the disclaimer out there. This is not about stigmatising my community, right?
I do have to say, though, Julian, because it's a relevant point. Lots of questions have come to us tonight. It's really important to say that we've been overwhelmed with questions about crime, even though people could ask anything. And I think that does say that there is some concern in the community.
Absolutely there is. I'm out every weekend door knocking. I was out in Narre Warren South on Saturday, in Dever Hills a few weekends before that, spent January in Dandenong West. You know, I move around. You know, you share yourself around. And I do it actually because it cheers me up. It makes me feel better about people. It gets you outside the toxic social media bubble and out of your emails. And absolutely, there's a community concern about crime. 100% agree with what you've said. I find that I've spoken to people who've suffered home invasions. But I just want to get 2 points on the record about the data, because what Jon said's spot on. In some categories, things are up, 10 to 17-year-olds. But in 18 to 24-year-olds, things are significantly down over the last 4 years. So it's a mixed story. What we're seeing, though, the number of unique offenders, youth offenders, hasn't changed. The number of unique offenders hasn't changed. We've got a small cohort of those unique offenders, youth criminals, who are recidivists. They're committing crimes over and over again. So, you know, owning the issue, but it is in our Federation of State and Territory lead responsibility where they're working with them. But I strongly support what the state governments are doing to toughen bail laws, to deal with the justice side, for exactly your point. There ultimately has to be some responsibility. But, you know, a guy who suffered a home invasion in Dever Hills, it wasn't violent, thank goodness. The car was stolen. He said to me, the first response shouldn't be for a first offender to put him in jail because we breed better criminals. So early intervention, actually trying to find out what the problem is. It's expensive dealing with people case by case, but it's a relatively small number of repeat offenders. As a society, we're much better to let the state governments and support them in that to make that investment than breed better lifelong criminals. So it's a complex story.
Maria.
So, from my perspective, I think, especially when you look at the criminal age of responsibility being 10, it certainly needs to be raised, because when we're talking about these crimes, absolutely, Susie. I mean, I fear for my parents too. I have the same concerns. I live alone. But when we are talking about young people and we want to just impose harsher penalties and harsher consequences, I think what we need to be asking ourselves is, what is the root cause of criminal behaviour? Because when we're talking about kids, here's the thing about offending youths. Very often, they are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds themselves. They are coming from backgrounds where they've faced harm and violence and neglect and abuse. So these offenders are actually victims themselves. They're victims themselves. And so what I would say, based on the research that I've looked at, is that tougher penalties, they just disproportionately affect the most marginalised kids in our society, that is Indigenous kids, who are 17 times more likely to be locked up. And when they go into the criminal justice system and have contact, what ends up happening is they are less likely to pursue education and employment prospects. They're more likely to reoffend and receive a prison sentence by the time they're 18. Instead, social scientists, they tell us what works is rehab, like Nyadol says, rehabilitation programs. We're talking about giving them behavioural, education and counselling support. So I think when we get to the root cause and we support them, and if we treat youth crime like a health and welfare issue instead of a criminal issue, I think we're going to get further.
Interesting point. Now, I'd like to bring in Atifa Ahmed. Hello, Atifa. Now, Atifa, you do some work with the local council in Dandenong. What do you do?
Yes, so this year I'm a part of the City of Greater Dandenong Youth and Family Services Young Leaders Program. I'm here with everyone today. I'd just like to preface by saying absolutely youth crime is a serious issue, but I agree with a lot of what's been said. And the most important thing is, if we want young people to do amazing things, we need to show that they can do amazing things. We need to put them in the spotlight, put the amazing things that they're doing in the spotlight. So just over the past few weeks, we planned and facilitated a youth leadership forum. We brought together young people from all over Southeast Melbourne to get their input, their priorities and concerns to inform the council action plan over the next 4 years. And the overarching sentiment that we heard from our attendees was that they'd love to see more events like this. They'd love to hear about more events like this, but it's just not there. So if we want people, young people especially, young people from multicultural backgrounds, young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, we want them to do amazing things. We need to show that they're doing amazing things as well.
Tifa, are you worried that there's only negative stories being told about your community?
Yeah, absolutely. I just, also something else I'd like to note. A few weeks ago, we had the Springvale Snowfest. It happens every year. Super fun, super family-friendly event. But unfortunately, after it, there was a stabbing incident. And it made national news, and there were really terrible headlines out there saying young teens are out of control in Springvale, and balaclava-wearing youth are causing gang violence. And this type of thing made it to national news. But yet again, you don't see the good things that young people are doing making it to national news. It's just overshadowed by all these negative stereotypes, I would say.
Yeah, well, there's the old saying, thank you, can I say. And we're really glad you joined us tonight, because I think telling the whole story is the job of actually a broadcaster like us, but actually everyone. But Jon, I mean, there's a saying, right? If it bleeds, it leads. Yeah. It's an old-fashioned saying, but you do often emphasise the negative news. Sure. But clearly there is a part of the community saying, you're not seeing us in our full.
Yeah, and so the challenge is how to tell those stories and how to tell them in a way that captures people's imagination. And so it's really hard to persuade people about hope. It's really easy to make people afraid. Yeah. So the challenge is to work harder on hope in order to swamp fear. Mm. And the other great saying is that a lie will go around the world before the truth has got out of bed. So we have to work harder. If we believe in democracy, which is under threat these days, all around the world, 40% of young Japanese kids, when polled, said they didn't think that democracy was the best way to run Japan. I mean, for goodness sake, what's going on here? If we believe in these things, we actually have to work at it. We have to build people's understanding of the agreement that we all enter into between the human being and the state. That transaction that we have as citizens, it's really precious. People die for that relationship that we just take for granted. And we don't work at it. We've got to tell that story of what it means to be in a community. So when you've got kids who are excluded or feel excluded or actively think, I've got no prospects here, well, what do you think happens? Yeah. They'll go out and they'll snatch and grab because they think it's the only way to get stuff that everyone else seems to have. So we actually have to work at including people, at making this community function properly, getting the gears to mesh. Got to do the maintenance on democracy.
Our next question is from Jamil Kaur Singh. Hi, Jamil.
Hi. Following on from what Susie was saying, why are parents not being held accountable for their kids' actions, and why are kids not being taught consequences, as Susie said? What services are we actually providing for parents to be given strategies, to be given support on how to deal with youth, how to parent, and how to discipline bad behaviour?
Nigel.
I think the point all of us are trying to make isn't to excuse criminal behaviour. And if it needs to be said, I can say it again, criminal behaviour is never excusable. Nobody, well, and even if you're a person who have experienced certain disadvantage, it is a matter of understanding, not a matter of excuse for behaviour. So I think we start there. But the reasons why we bring in other aspects of it, one of all, it just makes sense, you know, in the sense that as adults, we have to do the hard work of balancing what solutions are better for now and for the future. That means finding ways to hold young people accountable, but it also means looking at the systemic root cause issues that are impacting the life of those young people. That, for example, might mean the way our media works. It might mean the way we fund our schools. It might also mean looking at the social structure in which we have that has depleted, you know, people's ability to earn a living. And as a result, parents are unable to actually be there for their parents. Able to understand all these things is an excuse. It gives us the chance to find what are the best solutions going forward. It also means that we can give hope to young people, because it is to be condemned when you're told this is it, you are trash for the rest of your life. We cannot also have that solution. We must find a hopeful way for them. And I think when we provide them with means, including accountability, we are also presenting opportunities and pathways for hope. So that, to me, is why it's important. I think the final bit I want to say, and I think it's a different perspective here. Some of us might be quite insistent on emphasizing the need for not vilification of young people as a whole. I don't know what everyone experiences, but anytime I hear there's a crime that has occurred, my prayer is, I hope it's not a black kid. And the reason I do that is because the next day, all of us are criminals.
Yeah.
Our children are criminals. Yeah. It doesn't matter what we've done. It doesn't matter how good we are. We are criminalized as a result. And so we know the other layer, too, of what happens when we have this blanket approach to the way we talk about it, when we talk about communities like this. And that is, so I want to say to Susie, and I want to say to you too, like, I'm not at all trying to discount what it must feel like to feel unsafe, right? I am trying to wrestle, as we must as adults, with all the perspective and all the context that we need to bring to a question.
Jamil, have you experienced crime in the local area? Have you had your own experience of it?
I have. We've had a home invasion. I was actually overseas, and unfortunately, young kids broke into the house and took all the keys for the cars and decided my Mercedes was a good one to take away with them. But in the process, Mum was actually asleep in her bedroom while this was all taking place, and that fear factor has made a big difference. But the other thing that's happened is I've been canvassing to be an independent councillor for the Casey Council in the last couple of weeks in the Waratah ward, and especially going through Doveton, Hallam, Hampton Park, these areas are constantly being targeted by youth crime, and the shop owners are in fear. They can't say anything to the kids. The police come and see the CCTV camera footage, and they'll turn around and say, oh, we know exactly who they are, but there's nothing that's being done about it. The same way that when the kids are actually taking things off their shelves and putting it in, and the owner's standing there looking at them going, what are you doing? The kids will turn around to them and say, what are you going to do about it?
And next, we're going to hear from Cheryl and Anthony.
Hello, everyone. Being a female myself and living in one of the most diverse cities in Dandenong, my safety becomes the first priority for my parents when I step out every day to attend school. The need for money to survive and the need to sustain financially is one of the driving forces for youth crime. What will the government do to curtail the cost of living and in turn reduce the amount of youth crime?
It's an interesting question. Julian.
Thank you for your question, and just sort of weaving the previous two together, and I will address it. I think you beautifully encapsulated most parents want the best for their kids, and most parents care about their kids. I've been a parent. My daughter's 28 now. We all look back at times, no parent is perfect, and think, I wish I'd done that, I wish I'd seen that earlier. And I do think that overall parents try to do the best by their kids. On the cost of living question, the cost of living pressures are real. They're right across the country. They're being felt in our community. The government is doing a range of things. I won't bore you with, we can go through it if you want.
Oh, no lists.
No lists, exactly.
It's a list-free zone.
List-free zone. Everyone's getting a tax cut, whatever their age. Every household's getting the $300 energy rebate now.
He's doing the
challenge.
list.
No, I'm stopping the list. I'm stopping the list. No list. The challenge for the government at the moment, it's been that for the last 2 years, is a lot of people here are old enough to know what inflation does to an economy. Inflation is prices rising faster than incomes, basically, and that's what puts pressure on people. It's low and middle income earners that frankly get screwed. in an inflation crisis. People who have lots of wealth and assets actually do really well in an inflation crisis because the value of what they had goes up relative to other people. And so the biggest economic challenge for the government has been to put downwards pressure on cost of living through cutting inflation. Inflation's more than halved from its peak around when we came to office. Things are heading in the right direction, but there is a lag, I get that, between the data that you see nationally and how people feel, right? And that's the bit we're in at the moment.
Do you think cost of living is linked to crime?
I was just about to touch on that. I'm old-fashioned, I'm a nerd. I think public policy has to be based on evidence, and I'm happy to be persuaded of a better argument. But given what I said before about most youth crime being driven by a hardcore group of reoffenders, I'm not aware of the link between cost of living pressures, which are real, and people doing repeat crime to show off to their mates, exactly as was put before.
Probably not that category, but Zoe, do you think the cost of living crisis is having an impact on crime?
I certainly think it's contributing to a sense of desperation and an annihilation of aspiration and hope. I think people have been doing it tough for so long that they don't quite know how they're going to get out of it. And as Julian has refrained from giving you a list, I will refrain from giving you a list of the things this government is not doing to address inflation. But I do think it contributes to a sense of malaise. But I think also, to tie in the question that was asked before, we've become very good as a society about talking about kids' sense of happiness, and you need to be happy, and you need to be beautiful, and you need to be successful, and you need to be noticed. Call me old-fashioned, but we used to talk about purpose, right? Used to have purpose. You know, I had my first job at 12, my second job at 14, my third job at 15. You know, when I was an 8-year-old, I'd walk around the wards here at Dandenong District Hospital with my mum. That's what was fun on the weekend, mate. It wasn't 12 hours of Netflix and Snapchat and Insta and TikTok, whatever. You know, I feel for your generation because you don't know boredom. Man, boredom was my best friend. Yeah. But it was a really useful thing to help you plan and aspire and hope and design and dream and read. That's old-fashioned. But it was a good one, right?
But neither of you have talked about the most important thing, though, which is growing inequality.
Yep.
Yeah. And the inequality in our community is tearing us apart.
So the growing inequality and so also the fact that, you know, I get the boredom. I'm a nerd and I love boredom, and I think everyone should read. But at the same time, I also know that young people are growing up at a time in which we've lost trust in institutions. Because for years, we've seen government action that hasn't consistently held up to the aspirations of which people lived through. The generation that came up have had opportunities that the generation coming will never have. We are facing climate change issues that are not sufficiently being addressed. So it is not enough to ask young people, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No.
It is not enough to ask young people to be hopeful when the solutions that are being presented for them about their future are in themselves not either imaginative or responsive to their immediate needs.
And it's unrealistic.
Maria, I want to bring in...
Just one more thing. You've got increased homelessness and desperation and record sales of imported luxury cars. I mean, give me a break.
Yeah.
You've got to put these together and go, there's something actually wrong here. What are we doing about it?
Yeah.
What are you doing about it?
Maria, at the start of that question from Sherlyn was, you know, hi Sherlyn, that was an excellent question, was feeling unsafe as a young woman. And that's kind of, we talk about crime. Crime, of course, has many manifestations, but that's a big part of the crime story too, right?
Absolutely. I have a few things to say just about a couple of things here. One, Sherlyn, a hugely relevant issue that you've brought up here, and I just want to say, I think cost of living, I'm just going to try and sum this up and be concise because so many valuable things have been said, but cost of living, yeah, in some cases it does contribute to youth crime because people are doing things because they can't afford basic necessities. And at the moment, when we talk about the cost of living, I have to say the current tax and rental system, it absolutely does screw over low and middle income earners. It does. And people are now in a position where things like showers and electricity and food, they're considered a luxury. The rental crisis is pushing people to homelessness. Housing's a wealth generator. It's not treated as a basic human right, which it should be. And so we are seeing the results and consequences of what the current economic situation is play out in this way. But when we talk about young people and youth crime, my ears perk up when people say that, you know, yes, Zoe, the previous generation absolutely had a sense of purpose, but young people today are some of the most purpose-driven agents of change. And just because, you know what, I am chronically online, I'm chronically on TikTok. Like many young people today, we're all on social media, but that is a vehicle for change. I know a 16-year-old teen activist named Anjali Sharma, who is currently the lead litigant in a class action lawsuit against the Australian Federal Court because of their inaction on climate change. Young people, they're changing the world because the way they're inheriting it, because of previous generations, it's not great. So I think when it comes to things like youth crime and the cost of living, there are so many different factors which play into it. But I think, like I said, and like Nyadol says, we have to be so careful about how we're talking about something that's very complex, very multifaceted, because when it comes to youths who are reoffending, they usually have come from backgrounds who are adverse. They have faced cycles of disadvantage, and there's so much more to it. So I think it's just about honouring that, and also honouring that young people, you've got a Wi-Fi connection, you've got a phone. We need to share our success stories too, because we are changing the world, and I'm proud of that.
Sherlyn, we're talking about young people, and there is some youth. You're youthful, but you're actually young. What do you want to do with the rest of your life?
Well, I want to make a change, of course, because I've seen a lot of things that happen inside my community. I've been brought up in Dandenong Square, my next home, and I've seen a lot of people steal iPhones and stuff. Security is always there, and that's what made me bring up this question actually today, because, well, what makes those young people just as the age as me to go and steal an iPhone? They need money. They need money for their family. They need money for themselves, and that's what makes me think that people like me, why would they have to go through all this stuff? So, well, one day I hope to sit in those seats like you, just make a change and voice for people that youth have today, pretty much.
Sherlyn, you can have a seat up here anytime. Honestly,
You can have mine.
You're already doing it. It's amazing.
An excellent point. You're watching Q&A from the Drum Theatre in Dandenong with Maria Thattil, Zoe McKenzie, Julian Hill, Nyadol Nyuon and Jon Faine. Our next question is from Daniel Watson. Hi, Daniel.
Hi. Good evening. My question to the panel. With record-breaking winter temperatures and extreme weather events like the recent deadly storms here in Victoria, as reported by the ABC article, tens of thousands of Victorian properties lose power after deadly winds topple trees. Why are Australian politicians still debating the causes of climate change? Will we ever reach a consensus that this is a man-made crisis requiring urgent and ambitious action?
Well, you're reflecting on some pretty wild weather today, and put your hands up if you didn't sleep last night. Yep. Most of us in Victoria had a pretty wild night. Some people obviously have lost their lives. There has been injuries, like lots of things have happened. But it has alarmed people. To the question, Maria, I want to start with you. The question is why people even debating climate change. I'm not so sure the debate is about climate change per se anymore. It's about how much action we should take, right?
Oh, yeah. I think there's no doubt about it. I mean, we've had record-breaking heat waves. We've had damaging winds. People are hospitalised. They're dying. Our infrastructure is being damaged. So I think the longer that this goes on and that there is inaction, because we're so aware that the window of time for something to change is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Like, we needed to do something yesterday. So I think that the further this goes, the more, I have to say, people do lose faith in politicians. And I think it was really disappointing to see that a Labor-led Senate committee actually rejected a bill where they were asking lawmakers to make sure that, I think it was their decisions, reflecting on whether their decisions have, effects on climate harm, and that bill was rejected, right? And so I think for me, when I think of generations that are coming up, like my partner has 2 toddlers that I'm very intimately involved in. When I think of them growing up, I want them to be growing up in a world where the government actually cares about the future they're going to inherit and they get a say in that. We need...
Julian, today has been a pretty intense day.
Yeah.
And we know that we have more extreme weather events all the time. No one's contesting that. But there is a sense of frustration at the scale of the action that you're taking.
Yeah, I'll just make a couple of points. Obviously, in extreme weather events like we're experiencing, the first priority of governments is to focus on the immediate, which is making sure people are safe. A huge shout out to the Greater Dandenong SES. I try not to be a stalker, but I'm a frequent visitor. It's the SES volunteers that are out there dealing often with the most vulnerable people right now, the people who don't have family and friends or resources to clean up their properties and keep themselves safe. So that's the immediate focus. Second point, it's obviously a bit silly to relate an individual weather event to climate change, but I absolutely, I've got a Science-tagram with a few people in the Parliament. I follow evidence.
Yeah.
Environmental stuff was one of the first things that got me into politics decades ago. And I'm frustrated, I'm angry that, our generation may be the first generation in modern Australian history to hand a lower standard of living, environmentally and economically, to those who come afterwards. Haven't got time to go back into inequality because you'll move us on, but all of that. I do think that the government is taking this seriously. We legislated one of our first things to set a binding target. The opposition opposed. I'm not going to give you the laundry list or I'll get into trouble. But the final point I'll make, just to contest one thing which you said in your introduction there, in a polite, friendly, don't give me that look way.
Let's see what this is.
Sadly, when I look opposite, I don't think it's an accepted fact that it's just about what you do about it. There are too many people in the Parliament, particularly some of the wackos on the crossbench in the Senate. But unfortunately, I really like Zoe. I'll say it here, fess up. I really like Zoe. We've worked
Zoe
together.
believes that climate change is real.
Zoe does, but not everyone in her party room does. They dance around it and they, duck and weave. When I look across at the Liberal and National Party, for God's sake, 20 years on, we're still having the climate wars. We're still nudge, nudge, wink, wink, footsie, footsie. Is the science even real? Like, look at the pattern of weather events. It's almost like the climate's changing like the scientists said it would.
Well, Zoe, it's actually being felt in your own electorate today.
You bet it is. Yeah. I've got coastlines falling into the water as we speak. Look, I think you described it well, Patricia, when you said it's not whether, it's how. And so we spent an enormous amount of time in our party room, led by Ted O'Brien, talking about that how. He's done a lot of work bringing everyone on board to understand what is involved in the current plan of government, but equally in the alternative that we have put forward.
Nuclear,
It is a brave move to say we should consider nuclear in this country, but one that I found was being considered elsewhere when I went to COP27 a few years ago. Everyone I spoke to, when they said, oh, it's so fraught in Australia, I said, yeah, thanks for that. What's your solution? And they said, well, nuclear, of course, and a bit of gas. And I went, really? And for them, it just seemed like such an obvious choice.
Do you want a nuclear reactor in your electorate?
For them. So, John, we have been really clear about where they will go. Do you want one down on the Mornington Peninsula in Flinders? We have been clear about where they'll go.
Gippsland ain't far away.
We've been clear about what studies and conversations will be led with the communities, and you don't put them in certain topographical areas where there might be a problem. That said, there was one in the Hunter the other day, and therefore there's a vibrant debate on foot in that area as to whether that is the right place for one. But we've been clear about where we think they should go, and we've been clear about a 2-year discussion with the communities affected. You've got to remember, at the moment, there's a proposal for 28,000 kilometres of overhead wires, and the communities that are going to receive them aren't very happy about that either. It's important to have an honest conversation. But let me tell you how the peninsula is powered over summer. 8 diesel generators. Dirty diesel generators sitting on the side of the road. That's how everyone gets their aircon on the Mornington Peninsula.
In the event of an emergency, Zoe, not all day, every day.
They run the power in summer. They come in just before summertime, November, December, and they stay there till March or April. No, to run the peninsula. 8 of them. That's how we run the demand when we have 2 million people who come down over summer. That's how we do it, John. And every time I talk to United about a better backbone, a better structure, no conversation.
A nuclear plant in the 2040s that's too expensive and too slow. It's not a solution.
Okay. Just a quick one from you, Nyadol.
First, I want to apologize for interrupting you before. I can't wait to get bored together. But I wanted to pick up
You're never going to get bored.
I was going to pick up on something about the conversation about climate change, because most of it is the focus on what has happened, which is really important. I think we're not just seeing the scientific consensus, we're also seeing the facts. You know, we had bushfires a while back that were terrifying for any Australian who watched them. But I think part of what I am also concerned about, and it's missing both in the discussions that we're seeing both in the Labor and the Liberal government, is the waste of potential of Australia future in this space. We know that Australia has huge capacity for renewable energy, to the point that it's being referred to. To the point that our capacity is being referred to as potentially a nuclear, but not a nuclear, that's wrong, a clean energy superpower. Yeah. But because that opportunity is being wasted as we debate, we are essentially losing the ability to be able to be competitive in the future. And what is happening instead is that, and I'm not saying this in a competitive way, I'm just saying it to, for understanding, what is happening is that China then is dominating a lot of this emerging clean energy infrastructure. Throughout the whole, you can almost not build an electric car now without China involvement. You cannot build a solar panel without China being involved in that value chain. That is an economic and national security dependency that I am concerned that we're not also looking at those aspects of why areas in which, for example, the Liberal have prided themselves, national security and economy, why we're not thinking about this issue of climate change and our ability to be competitive in the future, and to reduce the abilities of other nations to be able to exert such influence on our nation as a whole, because we're so dependent on them for our economic existence.
Our next question comes from Janak Gurana. Hi, Janak.
Hello. So, I'm an immigrant who came here by choice, on merits, with the point-based system, which I really love. And I've spent 60% of my life in Australia. I've built a family, worked really hard, owned a home, and I've contributed to technological advancements in manufacturing. I'm deeply concerned about the far left shift in our country, with public schools pushing a woke mindset, a surge in immigration of all sorts, wokeness in climate policies with the skyrocketing prices. So my question is, how long before Australia becomes unrecognizable from what it has been, the one that attracted me for its fairness and opportunities based on nothing else but merits alone? Thank you.
Maria.
Thank you for your question. I just want to start by saying one thing. Whenever we talk about woke agendas, right, and we talk about the far left movements and being super extremist, we are effectively talking about people who say advocate for the LGBTQIA+ community, who advocate for gender diversity, who advocate for these communities that are marginalized. And we hide behind the word woke when what we're talking about is speaking up for communities who need to have their human rights, dignities, and freedoms respected. So I'm a woman of color, I'm a queer woman of color, and I'm also somebody who's got 2 degrees. I worked in corporate, in HR, I studied management. So when we talk about merit and you're concerned about when you say the left movement, I assume you're talking maybe about diversity quotas or affirmative action and things like that. I can tell you why they exist. They exist plain and simply because underrepresented groups have faced systemic barriers and disadvantages when it comes to them accessing opportunities, right? And so when we have these movements, if we're talking about fairness and opportunity, if we really did live in such a meritocracy, then I think we would have equal representation of women, people of color, queer folk, and people with disability in positions of power and leadership already. Yeah? So In my opinion, because we do need these progressive movements to progress people who have started on the back foot and face significant inequity so that they can play catch up, because we all deserve to be seen and represented.
Janet, I want to bring you in because, you talk about your own experience coming to Australia and merit. How did you come to this conclusion? Like, what is your own experience where you feel like there is...
I haven't really faced any disadvantage. Like, I would very much like to think that, what I'm doing is because I'm good at what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I'm sure you are very good at what you're doing.
Absolutely.
I mean, I wouldn't take pride in thinking that I was just given something. I wouldn't want that.
I'm going to start by saying I'm woke. But
you're woke.
Me too, girl. Me too.
I do consider myself woke for two reasons. First of all, woke is a term that originated in the 1950s, 1960s in the Black liberation movement. And I think all of us can accept that in the 50s and the 60s, there was indeed discrimination. So there is a very different idea of what woke is and what it has become popular with. But even having said that I'm woke, I do accept that there are some problems with wokeness. Just as there are any problems with any social movement. There are excesses. There are times in which people aren't generous enough. Yes, there is absolutely problems. It doesn't mean that if you're woke, you're perfect. It means that you can behave in certain ways that you must hold yourself accountable for, and you must be held accountable for if you exceed. So I accept that criticism of woke, and I think sometimes people who are tagged that we want to push back and assume that the movement is somehow all saintly. It's not. Like any social movement, it has its problem. However, I also didn't come to Australia on a merit basis. I came as a refugee. That, to me, leads me to a point that I want to make, that merit is an important concept, but it's not without bias. There's a beautiful book by a guy called Michael Sandel that talks about the tyranny of merit. I would highly recommend it because I think it really deconstructs merit as a framework for which we use in certain contexts, but not in all contexts, right? For example, housing. Housing is a human right. If we were to believe that housing is a merit-earned thing, we will lock out a lot more people out of the support they might need. There are going to be areas in which we do emphasize an element of merit as a pure measure, but it cannot become the only social value in which we measure everybody's access to even fundamental rights. So I think that's where I differ. My final bit. My final bit is the idea that somehow merit and diversity represent certain group of people. Despite the fact that I came to this country as a refugee, I'm lucky. I'm absolutely lucky. I went to school. I did a law degree. I did a BA. I did practice. I worked hard. Yet every time I walk in the room, people think that I'm a diversity thing because of assumptions like that, assumptions that assume simply because you came from a certain thing or hold a certain view or you're woke that you're sort of somebody who got there by chance. That's also destructive because people like myself who have also really worked hard get trashed, get undermined, get diminished because we're women and because we look like this because somebody think that we don't deserve what we've done. That is a problem.
Janet, really powerful point. But Janet, I'm wondering if there is some ground where we can bring you two together. Isn't that partly what you're saying that annoys you, that you feel like you've got merit, but people go, oh, you're here just because of this reason?
I think when I look at the laws, they're all sorted. So what are we even talking about? Like, the laws are sorted.
I don't know. But is it that?
Tell me, like, which legislation still discriminates or, disadvantage or whatever it is. I think it's all sorted.
That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is assuming that even when we put in legislation to assume a particular perspective, for example, until I had kids, I did not realize how hard it is that we've built everywhere for people who can walk because I didn't have a pram. The assumptions that sometimes we make, the assumptions we make when we pass legislations, the assumption we make when we build societies are built from our own preferences. Doesn't mean people are evil. It just means that sometimes we think equality looks a particular way, but actually in its practice and its delivery, we discover that other people might need more. It is not a matter It is not a matter of saying that these people need to be charity and looked after. It's a matter of recognizing that even the very idea of merit isn't something that you as an individual somehow came up with. I did not choose a particular mindset. I was lucky to have it. Yeah. So we have to have some grace as human beings to realize that our existence, perhaps it's much more clear to me as a person who got out of a refugee camp, born out of refugee camps and came to Australia, and I know the only difference between me and my friends back in South Sudan that are as talented, as smart, and as hardworking is the opportunity to come to Australia, and I did not earn that.
I've just got to check. Do people even know what woke means?
No.
I knew that. People keep referring. Is it just like a woke? Are you woke, Jon Faine?
I'm the token pale, stale male on the panel. I mean, you know. But
you're
woke,
a diversity target.
If woke means that you care about other people and you care about human rights, you care about inequality, you care about fixing some of the problems in society, then yeah, call me woke. That's fine. But
it's interesting sometimes, guys, in the political world, a word takes off, but most people in this audience, Zoe, were like, I don't know what that means. It's meaningless.
I think a lot of people don't know what it means, actually. And I think it's a fluid meaning as well. I think to a 60-year-old, it means something quite different to a 15-year-old to a 30-year-old.
And if you don't watch Sky After Dark, you wouldn't know what it's sort of, referring
and I think
to anyway.
As soon as, Jon Faine says he's woke, then
dead.
It's just, that's it. It's dead in Gen Z now, isn't it? I say that lovingly, you
Absolutely.
know that.
Post-woke soon.
You have to come up with another term.
If you're woke, I'm no longer woke.
Okay.
Let's hear now. We've got another question from Rathi Bartlett.
I was terrified I'd get asked.
Hello, everyone. I'm the victim of fast-track process. In the last 6 weeks, 3 refugees in Dandenong, including my friend Mano Yokalingam, who self-immolated, have died facing deportation. With 8,500 people affected by the previous government fast-track process and denied a future here. Why can't the Labour government grant us permanent visa after 12 to 15 years in Australia?
Julian.
Thank you for asking that, and thank you for being here, and I'm deeply sorry for the loss of not just Mano, but the other 2 people you referred to. Just on Mano, given you mentioned it, when I was asked in media interviews last week, I hadn't yet been briefed. I'm newly appointed to the ministry in the Home Affairs portfolio. I have now. The fact that any human being can get to the point in their life with their own mental health or struggles that not only does taking your own life feel like an option, but it's a choice that you make is horrific. And every decent, not just Australian, but every human being feels that. And I really do feel for you. Our community is home to a large number of asylum seekers, about 700 in the city of Greater Dandenong, some more in Casey, and they're part of our community. They're people we know, they're people, parents at the school, they're neighbours and friends. And I just want to humanise that. On Mano's case, I have been briefed now. It's complex, and we do need to not jump to conclusions that there's one single issue and let the proper inquiries run their course. That's all I can say on that right now. On the general issue, I'm not avoiding it. I'll just make 2 points. I am really proud of the fact that as a government, and hasn't been politically popular and hasn't been without controversy from Peter Dutton, that we've now granted permanent protection, permanent visas to this country to 19,000 people who were stuck in limbo for 10 years. And I've spoken for years in the Parliament that it does our community, it does our society, it does our country no good to have permanently temporary migrants who've been found to be genuine refugees and owed protection by Australia. I'm proud of that. There's about 1,000 of those 19,000 cases still left. They're being worked through. Most of them have complex identity questions and they just take time, but more are being granted each week. Of those people then on bridging visas, they fall into a few categories, and enormous empathy, but just to headline it, because I think there's a lot of misinformation spread on social media about this. There's about 200 people still in merits review in the tribunal. There's about 4,500 who are still in the courts in judicial review process. We've allocated more resources to the courts to speed up those decisions. There's now about in the order of 2,000 people who are on bridging visas who have been now able to apply for permanent visas, who are also in the queue. So we're down to about 2,500 people who've been found not to be owed protection, not genuine refugees in common language. Some of those were through the fast-track process of the former government. They're not forgotten, but the truth is this is one of the most complex areas of migration law. Every case is different, and there is no magic wand that a minister has just to intervene and wave a wand. We are moving through those cases as fast as humanly possible, and Tony Burke, as the new minister, is looking at it again. But I just put that context there. The vast majority of people who've been here for 10 years now have permanent visas, are sponsoring their families and being able to be reunited with their children, which the previous government did nothing on. It was utterly inhuman, and, you know, at a basic human level, that's important for our community, but it's important for our country. Of those remaining people, I know them. I see Wiki Wickramasinghe up there, who's been president, and 30 years I've known you, Wiki. I won't say how old you are. You had a special birthday last year, but some of the key advocates nationally, you're sitting next to the Mayor of Greater Dandenong, who deserves enormous credit on behalf of the council for sticking up for these cases. So we are looking at it, but I just give people that context that there's different categories.
Okay. If this conversation has caused you any distress, you can call Beyond Blue on 1300 22 4636 or Lifeline on 13 11 14. Next we'll hear from Sophia Redjev.
Hi. International students and refugees contribute significantly to our economies, migrants as well, and our cultural diversity. Yet they're facing a cap and exorbitant fees and are blamed for issues like the housing shortages and the cost of living crisis. These crises are driven by systemic problems of inadequate housing policies and wage stagnation. How can the government justify placing blame on international students, migrants and refugees rather than addressing the root causes?
Okay. Jon? How do you reflect on seeing the government introduce this cap?
Well, I have to declare an interest first. I'm part-time at the University of Melbourne, where I have a weird role called a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow, so I'm partisan, I'm not independent on this. But it's a nonsense to say that there's any connection whatsoever between international students and Australia's housing crisis. International students don't live in the suburbs. Yeah. They live in student accommodation, and it's purpose-built, and it's around in little clusters around where universities are. It's an absolute furphy. The problem with housing is to do with the fact that a couple of elections ago we rejected a solution, which was to eradicate negative gearing, and we turned our back on that. And that's democracy in action. You have to accept the decision. But unless you've got the bank of mum and dad behind you, your chances of putting out a deposit for a house in Australia at the moment are absolutely zero. And that's appalling. It's pathetic. It's absolutely entrenching inequality at the most fundamental level. But that's going away from students. So universities are basically saying, well, you're killing off one of our most successful export industries, apart from which it's also a pathway for a lot of people to understand Australia and our values, and some of them then say, can I come and live here? Not a lot, proportionally, some, but without the input from working overseas students into the local economies of all of our university cities, I mean, quite frankly, the place had grown to a halt. It's absolutely an own goal. It's a ridiculous own goal that the government's pursuing.
Well, Julian Hill, you weren't in favour of hard caps not so long ago.
No, I wasn't. I spoke in the Parliament and I said that we need a limit for governments to manage the onshore numbers and shape the market.
You said it was a terrible policy tool.
What I said, I'll put it in context. I mean, we can all take little bits of quotes of long and very thoughtful speeches, which are there on the Hansard. I used to run this sector in Victoria as a senior public servant before I was in Parliament. I love international education. It's an enormous success story for Australia. Too often we focus on the economic benefit, $48 billion, but the soft power, the internationalisation of our campuses and cities, and that very small number of students who stay and contribute as highly skilled migrants, building wealth, having paid for their education. Absolutely terrific. Fact, there will always be more offshore demand to study onshore in Australia than we can ever meet. And we inherited a sector that was growing unsustainably. Look, I think Jon and I would agree more than we disagree on this, but some of what you said is simply not accurate. There are many international students that live right through the suburbs.
So you think they are taking housing?
I didn't say that, but I'm just responding to specific points.
But what's their impact on housing?
All right, we need a mechanism for a government to manage the numbers. That's the core point which I think everyone would agree on. Zoe and I chair the Parliamentary Friends of International Education. We're pro this. But I don't think any Australian would say we can just let untrammelled growth come, because it's simply not true that all international students live in purpose-built student housing. It's just not true.
Zoe, I just want to give Zoe the last word because we're out of time. But Zoe, do you think you should go even further with the caps?
Look, I think it's important to take a careful step-through approach. You know, I went back onto my notes. I used to work in higher education policy as well. And 20 years ago, when I was looking after this area, we had 132,000 international students. Last year, there were 760,000 visas issued for international students. I was talking to one of our universities in Victoria the other day, and they said, oh, look, but the international student market only takes up 4% of the housing. And I said, 4%? You do realise if we released 4% of the rental market back into the rental market, we wouldn't have a rental crisis. And they said, yes, but you know. And I said, it's okay. I'm not suggesting we're going to do that. What I'm suggesting is you have to make sure that we're keeping a pace in terms of the accommodation we are providing for Australians and also for students. We used to build about 220,000 houses a year. At the moment, we're building about 160,000. It's all going in the wrong direction because the incentives are not there for people to build. We need to keep building and creating opportunity for people to have a home.
What a perfect opportunity, because next week we're talking housing. Can I thank the panel? What a great panel. What a great city you are. Maria Thattil, Zoe McKenzie, Julian Hill, Nyadol Nyuon and Jon Faine. Next week, we'll be in Sydney for a conversation about housing. The panel includes Claire O'Neill, the Minister for Housing and Homelessness, the Shadow Minister Michael Sukkar and commentator Alan Kohler. Thanks for your time tonight. How much do I love Dandenong? A lot. See you next week.